Hey there, welcome to a brand new episode of Deeply Rooted. We appreciate you tuning in. The last time we were together, it was episode 73, and we kicked off our church history series. And we appreciate Pastor Josh Banks here of Shepherd's Rock Bible Church being with us again for episode 2 of that. Don't forget, if you missed the first one, go back. Make sure you subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can also find us there on Apple Podcast as well. So both of those platforms are great to check us out on. Also, head on over to our Facebook group page at Deeply Rooted, and you can find us at our website, deeplyrootedpodcast.com. We put up some new blog posts there for you, and also that'll take you to all the previous episodes. They're all archived on there, and will take you directly to our YouTube channel to find any of those that you might have missed before. So lots of great content, but we're really looking forward to today's. Picking up where we left off the last time, we had pretty much finished there, getting us into the Middle Ages. So this will be our, I guess, part 2, we'll call it that. But I want to pick up around roughly 400 in that area, and we'll work through that. But the guy's name that comes to mind immediately when we get to this area is Augustine. And I'm just going to frame it this way, very briefly. Like, who is he? What did he do? And why is he so important to us, even today in modern church?
Well, I think it would take hours to go through something like that because there is so much on him. He is such a towering figure when it comes to church history and the influence that he had over many of the guys that we look back on in the Reformation, of Luther especially, Calvin, of some of our own modern day guys like Dr. R.C. Sproul.
Right.
He is such a giant in the faith. When it comes to his theology and the way that he articulated his theology. But going back, really, there are some of the great books that he wrote that we can benefit by as well, and we'll get to those also. But looking at his life that really influenced those particular books, like his Confessions and the City of God.
Yeah.
Here you have this guy, born in the 4th century. He lives a very licentious life. He's, his mother's praying for him. You probably heard the stories on that. But you have a guy who is seeking after knowledge. He's trying to learn. He's trying to understand the world that is around him. And he's living a very licentious life. Like I said, he's entering into a number of relationships. He has child out of wedlock. He's trying to control his passions and trying to seek out things in order to do that. And some of the early things that he had turned to was this particular faith called Manichaeanism. And there were some other early church fathers that started out here too. But this particular religion was actually founded by a Persian. His name was Mani. And he was actually executed himself in 276, 277. He was the founder of this faith. And so you have this guy who is trying to control his urges, trying to understand the world, trying to see this duality that he finds within himself. He's seeing it out in the world. He wants answers to these things. So he turned to this particular religion, and this religion pictures the universe as the scene of an eternal conflict between two powers, one good and one evil. And these two powers are also at war in man. So this really resonated with him because he's looking at himself and he's saying, this is the struggle that I have.
Right.
And he's coming across this teacher and this guy's writings. This must be the answer to some of that. But it was very, very dualistic, just as we've seen in some of the other Gnostic ideas. That the spiritual part of him was the good, and it wars with his evil side, which is his physical side. And he must rid himself of this evil. And there's various ways in which he sought to do that. Through prayer, through abstinence of his evil passions, which never worked for him, obviously. But like Gnosticism, this particular belief system believed that the true Jesus had no body and didn't actually die. He taught men the way out of darkness, is the way that they looked at Jesus. But even though he stayed in this for, I think, nine years, somewhere around a decade maybe, but he never could discipline himself. He never could rid himself of those fleshly desires and carrying them out.
So very works-based,
Yes.
obviously, and realizing that, I don't measure up. Like he's going to have to come to that conclusion that I can't do this.
Yes, and that's what had happened, because he just started losing hope in it and losing interest in it, because it wasn't working.
Right.
It wasn't doing anything for him. But he had secured a professorship at the State University in Milan, and this was obviously by the very providence of God that this happened, because there he came under the preaching of the Bishop Ambrose, who was another giant in the faith. And under his preaching, he was converted. He was converted in a very powerful way. And once he was converted, and then he moves to North Africa, and he eventually becomes the Bishop of Hippo. And now again, Ambrose is one of those giants in the faith, very powerful preacher. And again, you have to look at Augustine's emphasis on providence and all the things that he came up with, because, this was very evident in his own life. Here he had been out searching for all these answers, turning to different religions, trying to understand the world, all of that. It comes under the preaching of Ambrose. Ambrose preaches this powerful message. Augustine is converted. He's converted in a very powerful way. And as he is growing in the faith and all of that, he ends up going to North Africa, becomes the Bishop of Hippo. And there, of course, we have a number of his testimony of his life and how he lived, which is in his confessions.
Yeah.
But some of the big controversies that he entered into are some of the ones that are known to us that still apply to us today, because there are people who believe some of these things,
Sure.
which is the Pelagian controversy. So you have Pelagius, who is also in North Africa, and he is teaching that the fall of Adam did not affect all men, that we don't inherit original sin. He indeed sinned, and he set a bad example, but his sin is not passed on. You can actually, you could have the ability of living a perfect sinless life. Now, if you choose to sin, then that's something that you do, kind of thing. And Augustine, obviously, from looking at it from a biblical point of view, Augustine's saying, no, this isn't at all what the Scripture teaches, right? Because the Scripture teaches, through one man, sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and death is passed upon all men because all have sinned.
Right.
We inherited that original sin, that Adam's sin in which he committed in the garden, and his rebellion against God is also our sin. We are born sinners. And you've heard some of our own theologians today that will say, you don't sin, or you're not a sinner because you sin. You're born into sin, and you sin because you're a sinner. There's no getting around that.
Yeah.
Everyone is going to sin because you were born a sinner. There is no ability of man to not be a sinner, to not rebel against God.
Right. Scripture says we're shapen in iniquity.
Yes.
Right. Romans 3:23, all have sinned.
Yes.
Like, we can't escape that.
And again, Paul says in Ephesians 2 that you were by nature children of wrath.
Right.
But so this is the controversy. Pelagius is teaching one thing, and so he and Augustine have their debates and their controversy that all of this is brought up, and it really stirred up within Augustine his focus on salvation by grace. So sin is not inherited from Adam. Death is not a consequence of Adam's disobedience. Adam introduced sin by his example, but there is no connection between Adam and the moral condition of man at all. Absolutely contrary.
Right.
So you have this great exchange between Augustine and his writings really emphasizing salvation by grace, which we benefit from today. And that's the thing, is some of these guys and what they wrote and how they wrote it and how they articulated those great doctrines. And especially with Augustine, you have his emphasis too on the sovereignty of God that Luther's going to pick up on,
right.
that the Reformers are going to pick up on, that guys in our day are picking up on. And you can see how the Lord had brought up some of these men, these giants, and how we can still benefit from them. But his Confessions is a great spiritual autobiography. It really is. He wrote it over a decade after his conversion, and it really reveals his heart and his mind as a pastor. It's very evangelistic, and and it teaches of the soul's restlessness until it finds Christ, just as he was. Mm-hmm. So it's really, of course, it is his story, but it has such a profound impact on our own spiritual lives, on our own spiritual walk with Christ. And then you have the City of God, which really contrasts the world and the church. And it is also very evangelistic, as it exposes paganism, and it exposes the folly of paganism within that writing. And so Augustine, even though he's writing these very theological treatises, I mean, he's still showing his heart as a pastor, being very evangelistic and pointing out errors and establishing the Christian faith. And like I said, he influenced numerous men throughout history,
right,
and it still does today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in the midst of all that, AD 405, we have, and I believe dropped his name in the last episode, Jerome finishes what would eventually be called Latin Vulgate. That takes about 23 years of effort, so you can imagine the time that was put into that. Mm-hmm. That Bible, which he eventually finishes up, would be used, I mean, if you look at it, for nearly the next 1,000 years. This is going to be something that's widely read and put into practice. And by the end of this century, though, we have the Bible translated into nearly 13 languages. Mm-hmm. So clearly the word's spreading throughout this time here through the 400s. And then we get up to around 500, and this is kind of where we wanted to park on for just a second. Around 553, we see something called the Council of Constantinople. Now, this is really convened by the Emperor Justinian. And so the question really is, what was so significant about that meeting? Well, that meeting is really, it's piggybacking off of the Council of Chalcedon, 451. So you have these councils that are convened besides Nicaea. Nicaea was in 325. Right. You have the First Council of Constantinople in 381. You have Chalcedon. You have the Second Council of Constantinople. And again, because heresies are coming up, so you're still having to deal with Arianism. So whereas maybe the Council of Nicaea didn't quite articulate it enough, you have the Council of Constantinople, which really establishes the Trinity and the triune nature of God, and acknowledging the personhood and the deity of the Holy Spirit, equal with the Father and the Son. But then you have these other heresies that are coming up, Nestorianism, Apollinarianism, that are really focused in on the dual nature of Christ. So you have one that says, well, he has his divine nature, he has his human nature, and they are so separated from each other that basically he's two different people. You have the man, Christ Jesus, and then the Son of God. You have the other that looks at the dual nature of Christ almost like a hybrid, that his divinity and his humanity was so intertwined and mixed that he was some kind of a divine hybrid of sorts. So you had the Council of Chalcedon, which sought to establish the correct understanding of the dual nature of Christ. And when you're reading that particular creed, you're seeing how they're trying to explain these things in the negative. It's not this. It's not mixed. It's not intertwined. It's not confused. You have the two natures of Christ. His divine nature, he is fully God. He is fully man, or truly God, truly man. They're not mixed. They're not confused, and yet they make up the one man, Jesus Christ. So you have them articulating this even more so. So when you get to the Council of Constantinople in 553, again, it's focused on the nature of Christ. So it's establishing some very good Christology. So it affirmed that the single person of the incarnate Lord was in fact the divine Logos. It is one and the same person, not a hybrid, not two separate people.
So again, you have one council that will establish it, but then the next council perhaps will have to articulate something even more or establish it as this is what we said and this is what we're sticking to. So it really brought about some very good Christology for the church and establishing what the Word of God says, that Christ, the Logos, did become man, truly man, and he had a reasonable soul, as the confessions talk about. He had a mind, he had a human body, he was a man. He added humanity to his being, but he was the one man, the one person, Jesus Christ, the divine Son of God.
Let's keep the train on the tracks here. By AD 590, we're going to be introduced by a man named Gregory the First. A lot of people, maybe in your history books, would hear referred to as Gregory the Great. He's elected Pope. He begins to send missionaries, actually, into England, what we would know as England today. He's considered the actual first of the medieval popes. So we're starting to kind of break some new ground here on a new time period. And so by the beginning of the 7th century, we're going to see something that the church has contended with even to this day, maybe even more today than ever. Something that, we're, I think, more today in the American church very aware of, and that's the rise of Islam. Research still tells us arguably one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing religion in the world. Still second largest behind those people that claim to be Christian. So certainly this is a large number that's came about. But here in the 7th century, we see its roots. So how did that all play out, and where are we talking about in the geographic timeline of things? Well,
it starts with, of course, a man named Muhammad, who was born in Mecca. And of course, within Islam, that Mecca is their holy city, basically, right?
This is in Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
So we're looking at the Arabian Peninsula here for that kind of geographic slot.
Yes. So the prevailing view at that time, during his early years in which he's growing up and all of that, the prevailing view is you had tribal paganism. Every tribe had their own particular god that they served. The gods were kept in Mecca at the Kaaba, which again is one of their holy places now. So he grew up in that paganism. He actually became a very successful merchant in his adult years. He married a very wealthy widow. He journeyed through Mecca and Arabia. He would come into contact with Jews and with Christians, and he himself, from what I understand, from what I've read, had really gotten tired of the paganism of his day. And so there was a number of them in that time that was getting tired of the paganism, and they started to try to seek out the one creator God. So he's meeting Jews, he's meeting Christians, he's hearing all about the faith of the Christians and of the Jewish religion, and he had a place that he would go in order to pray and to seek after God. And the general name was Allah. It's Arab for God.
Right.
So in 610, he is in his cave, this place that he would go to pray. And from his accounts, he has this vision, and it's Gabriel who appears to him. And it's Gabriel who is establishing him as the new prophet of God. And so after he has this vision, he hears these words from Gabriel. He goes to his wife, and he's worried whether or not he is being deceived, by an evil spirit perhaps, which, interestingly, there are some very close connections with what happened to him and what happens to Joseph Smith.
That's exactly what I was thinking when you brought that up, the angel Gabriel. That sounds very familiar.
Yes. Yeah. So you think of an angel of light, and that's exactly what Smith said, but of course we're talking about Muhammad, but you go back to the scripture that even Satan can appear as an angel of light. But he goes to his wife, and his wife, says to him, would God allow such a good man as you to be deceived, kind of thing. So he starts establishing this new religion, these new principles that he has found, or that has been dictated to him. And to really sum up his new religion, you have what he came up with as the 5 pillars of faith that establishes the doctrinal understanding, or the way that they are
Right.
to worship, to believe, to practice. And the first of that was that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. You pray 5 times a day facing Mecca, which is actually something that we find people doing in the scripture. When you find Daniel in Babylon, and Daniel is praying, Daniel always prays facing Jerusalem.
Right.
Giving charitable gifts, fasting during their holy month Ramadan. The 5th is making a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life.
Yeah.
And of course, over time, his teachings and everything that he has been learning, or whatever, from this angel of light perhaps, or however that is occurring, ends up coming into what's called, of course, the Quran, which is their holy book. It's their Bible. It's made up of 114 chapters or surahs. There are a number of things that are mentioned in there that, of course, we would take exception with.
Sure.
You know, that Jesus is not God's son, that Jesus didn't die on a cross. It affirms his sinlessness. It affirms the virgin birth, and yet denies these other cardinal truths of the faith. So anyway, he starts preaching his new message. He's starting to gain a following there in Mecca. People in his family are being converted. But at the same time, almost just as it is for believers, in the time that you start criticizing somebody else's religion, you're going to end up having a lot of criticism
Right.
towards you, and a lot of harsh feelings towards you. So he ends up getting ran out of Mecca. He goes 200 miles north into Medina.
Yeah.
He preaches his message there. He amasses a great following. And eventually, he's going to come back down to Mecca with 10,000 soldiers. And he's going to destroy the pagan idols and all of that. And he's going to establish, of course, the Kaaba as a holy site. And make everybody worship Allah. Either you worship or you die.
Right.
And that is a lot of the way that Islam is spread,
Yeah.
and spread so rapidly. Of course, in some of those places where it did spread, you had people that were just nominal Christians anyway. Christians by name, but never were they actually converted.
Yeah.
So you have this army that comes in, kind of sounding similar in some aspects perhaps, but they put a sword to your head, or your throat, and you either convert or you die. Yeah, I think we'll do that.
Sure.
But that's how that religion was spread, and it was spread by the sword. And before you know it, within 100 years of its founding, you had this huge empire, this huge Islamic empire that was stretching from India into Spain.
Yeah.
I mean, in one way, it's fascinating how quickly it spread, but it spread because of those very reasons.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned it spreading to Spain. That's around AD 711. You see these Muslim Moors, they invade Spain and Portugal, that little peninsula there. And the next thing you know, they establish a foothold in Europe that would be there till really right around 1200. So we're talking a large chunk of time here where they really rule the roost there through North Africa, certainly the Arabian Peninsula, and then stretching on out, you get more into the Central Asian territory. But that gets us up to really into the latter part of the 8th century. There's so much conquest, and there's a lot of division going on. One of the big ones that stands out is this next thing we'll talk about, and this is what's referred to as the iconoclastic controversy. Now that sounds like a mouthful, and it really is, but really we're looking at icons. So explain what we're talking about with iconoclasm, and then what in the world by really 787 we see something around the Second Council of Nicaea. So help us tie all that together.
Well, one important thing to say is that by this time, of course, we know the fall of Rome happened in the 5th century.
Right.
But we remember as well that even Constantine's sons, when they came to power, pretty much ruled the empire as a tetrarchy, just like Diocletian did. So it was still split in east and west. And when the fall of Rome happened in the 5th century, it happened in the west, but not so much in the east.
Right.
So Constantine had moved the capital of the empire to Constantinople in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Istanbul.
Right.
He had moved it there, and so most of the political force and everything was now in the east. And this is where the emperors continued to reign in the Byzantine Empire. Now, in the West, of course, you had the fall of the Western Empire, all of that sort of thing. But you still had the church. The church was still there. The Bishop of Rome was still there. They are still, governing, like they did before in that sense. You had the Pope, who is the Bishop of Rome, who is revered probably higher than anybody else, at least in his own eyes.
Right.
And in the Western eyes. So you had these two particular branches of the church, what eventually will be the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. But at this time, they hadn't split yet. So you had an emperor that comes up in the east, Emperor Leo, and he feels that icons are a source of idolatry. So within the worship that occurred in both the Western and the Eastern empires, they used art, they used statues, they used drawings and pictures, and they would put them throughout the church in order to enhance the worship of the worshiper. As they're looking at these and they're seeing the presence of Christ in them and all of this sort of thing. So Leo says, well, this is idolatry. And so Leo begins this great crusade, if you will, against icons, pointing out how the children of Israel committed idolatry and all of this sort of thing. So he, even in the East, had a lot of pushback. He had a lot of pushback from some of the bishops that were there, some of the patriarchs that were there. Not everyone was on board with it, but you had him also trying to enforce those very those in the Western church because he's the emperor. He still considers himself to be the emperor over the entire empire. Those in the West are thinking, not really, not so much. And so you had this great controversy that had occurred with those in the West. The Pope is saying, we're going to continue to use icons. It's good to use icons. And then, of course, some of the ones that we'll talk about here in a minute, who come to power in the West, are also in agreement using icons. There was a huge statue of Christ at the gate of the church in Constantinople. And you had Leo that sends his troops out there, a squad of his troops, in order to pull it down, get rid of it. It's an icon. And when they did, the leader of the squad was attacked by an angry mob of women, and he was killed. He was beaten to death. So not everybody is on board with this, but it caused such a stir, and eventually this is some of the things that began to cause those divisions, not only with some of those already in the East, but especially with the Western Church itself.
Now that council there in Nicaea, this is recognized really as kind of the last binding council by both Eastern and Western churches, if we kind of had to put a bow on that. But what is the significance of what was resolved there at that one?
Well, with the Second Council of Nicaea, when they gather together for this, they're talking about the icons.
Right.
Whether or not it's permissible to use icons. And so you had Leo, who was adamantly against it. His son, Leo's son comes to power, and he's not so much against using these particular icons. Forgive me. It was actually Leo's son, Constantine V, who continued the opposition of icons. It was Constantine's son, Leo IV, who diminished the opposition because of his wife. His wife was one who enjoyed icons.
Okay.
She was one who, thought it was right to use them in worship and all of that. So this particular ruler, Leo IV, kind of gave in to his wife.
So, question of who wears the pants there. So.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. But after his death, the Second Council of Nicaea was convened for this very reason, and the ruling was the acceptance of icons.
Now that'll get us up to three figures that really, kind of turn some heads. All three of these men, obviously family, but they're very prominent. I mean, and not just church history, but if you're looking at just world history in general, these guys carry some weight, so to speak. So we're looking at really around AD 732 up through around 800, specifically 800. There will be a major event take place there. But these men are Charles Martel, and you and I were laughing about before we got on there, the hammer. And then we have Pepin, which is his son, and then we have Charlemagne, which would eventually be the grandson, so to speak. But what is the big deal with these guys, and how are they so tied together with some of these events?
Well, Charles Martel, he's really going to pave the way for Charlemagne when Charlemagne comes to power. Right. Pepin is going to have a significant role in that as well. You have Charles Martel, who is the military leader of the Franks. And in fact, he is known as the mayor of the palace. You had the Merovingian dynasty that was still there, but he was the real power behind the throne. Those kings were pretty much just figureheads, and Martel permitted them to keep their claim to the throne, as it were. But he's the real power. And
what area are we talking about here as far as in Europe?
We are talking about in the area, of course, of like France area. Okay. So, of course, him being the leader of the Franks, we're talking about that area specifically. So you have Martel, who is a very significant figure because, again, you having the spread of Islam. You have the Muslims that are conquering North Africa. They're spreading into Spain. They're controlling most of the peninsula by 711 AD.
So they're just south here. If you look at it geographically, France and Spain really just separated by a large mountain range.
Yeah. Yes.
So we've got two polar opposite worldviews here going on right next door to each other. So there's clearly some tension at the gate, so to speak.
Right. And that's where you have the hammer who comes in. So their expansion north was foiled by Martel at the Battle of Tours in 733. And this was a decisive victory for the Franks against the Muslims, because never again would they come in and try to invade because of Martel. And because of that, of course, he is referred to as the hammer. He's the one that held them back when it was, of course, as we were just talking about, how quickly it was spreading and how powerful that movement was, and just moving out everywhere. And you have this man who just halts them in their tracks, so to speak.
Now, his son Pepin, what is his role in all of this?
Well, Pepin is also going to be the mayor of the palace. Again, the real power behind the throne. And the difference then with Pepin and his father, Charles Martel held the title of the mayor of the palace. He was, I guess, in one way, he was crowned Caesar, but he still allowed the Merovingians to keep their status on the throne. Pepin, not so much. Pepin is going to appeal to the Pope, Boniface, to just go ahead and have them moved out, that he could become the king legally, officially. And so that's exactly what happened. So Pope Boniface granted this in 751, that Pepin was indeed the king of the Franks. And that event is also going to help pave the way for his son, Charlemagne. Right.
So when Charlemagne steps on the scene here, I guess the one that everybody always goes to is that Christmas special, so to speak. What was that big Christmas present for him?
Well, so here's some of the things that happened leading up to that, because this is gonna come into play because Charlemagne is going to have this alliance with the Pope,
right?
And a lot of the reason why this is occurring is, of course, you have the Western Church, who is gradually growing independent of the Eastern Church and finds a true ally in Charlemagne. And so you have, well, not only Charlemagne, but also with Pepin, of course. But you have Pepin, who pledged to give the papacy the territory of Ravenna. So this is called the donation of Pepin. This is what Charlemagne is going to uphold as well, which really brings their alliance even greater. So this gift is making the Pope the ruler over the Papal States. It's a strip of territory that extends diagonally across Italy from coast to coast. Again, called the donation of Pepin. So Pepin does this for the Pope. And interestingly, you have this struggle of power, of course. Popes are getting more powerful. These kings are getting more powerful. There's a little bit of conflict here, but they're forming an alliance. So when Charlemagne comes into play there, Charlemagne is also going to uphold the donation of Pepin in order to tighten that alliance.
Right.
And Charlemagne is one of the colossal figures also of European history. And Charlemagne is going to be crowned the supreme ruler, not just of the Franks anymore. Now he's going to be the supreme ruler over the Western Empire. So he is bringing back, in one sense, the old Roman emperor title, as he's going to be that guy.
And the important thing, really, to remember who's granting the power here, which is his buddy, the Pope.
Exactly.
So we've got, sadly, it's classic power politics in the thick of the church.
Yeah.
Which even today leaves a bad taste in people's mouths, no matter what you're talking. I don't care if it's local church or large scale. So we're already sensing this. You're going to see a massive distrust in your lay people here with what's going on. They're being left out. I mean, you're clearly seeing, power grabs by people, not just your political elites, but now we're seeing our spiritual, so-called spiritual elites as well now, back and forth. It's getting really muddy by this time. So, I mean, where does Charlemagne go from here now that he's got all of this tremendous power and his buddy the Pope's hand in hand with him?
Well, he takes upon himself the title Holy Roman Emperor.
Right.
And that in itself, because you still have the Eastern Empire.
Exactly.
You still have the emperor over there who's thinking he's the emperor over it all. And so by establishing that, again, the Western side of the empire is really moving away from any alliances with the Eastern. And especially when it comes to the church, you still only have technically one church. It's supposed to be the United Church. But some other things we'll get into in just a minute throughout many years are causing this big split between the Pope especially, because he wants to be the guy.
Exactly.
But then you have the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople believes the Pope is just as equal as he is, along with the Patriarch of Antioch and the Patriarch of Alexandria and the Patriarch of Jerusalem. They're all just looking at each other like we're fellow, ministers here. And the Pope, on the other hand, takes offense that one of the councils is believing the Bishop of Constantinople or the Patriarch of Constantinople to be anything of his equal. So it is a power grab. If we can establish this over here, we can establish the supremacy of Rome once again, because when it moved over to Constantinople, it's almost as if, actually they did call Constantinople the New Rome.
Right.
And so now you have the Patriarch over there, which leaves the Bishop of Rome out. And so it is. It's a power grab. It's forming a new alliance in order to establish that power even more. Now Charlemagne, even though he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor, even though technically he is now the emperor of the Western half, after his death it's not going to last. Even though the papacy itself is going to continue with power and growing in power and establishing power, it's not going to last. But he's still a very colossal figure within history. He led very successful campaigns against the Lombards, the Muslims, the Avars, the Saxons. But he spent most of his reign fighting in wars, as far as that goes. But
he really picked up a lot where his grandfather was so famous. More of the military type conqueror. Now, I believe it was 843 A.D. We start seeing his empire split, though, between, I believe it was 3 grandsons. Is that correct?
I believe that's right.
So we start seeing, this eroding of what had been at one time this massive accumulation of power for these guys. Of course, you mentioned, the fighting of the Muslims. They continue to spread through North Africa. You start seeing them making their way over really towards Central Asia. They really start picking up ground there. Eastern Europe actually starts seeing some of their royalties convert, so to speak. And so now we're seeing some very odd turns in certain places where the gospel's kind of working its way into. One of the things I found very interesting, you have an AD 999, like the very last year there, right before we hit this huge millennium turn, a guy by the name of Leif Erikson. So all of our Scandinavian fans out there are probably getting fired up now, but he converts while he's in Norway, up in that Scandinavian peninsula there, very, very high northern Europe. Then he starts bringing really the gospel into what we call Greenland today. So, what's going on there at the very end of this century and then really kind of walking us into the millennium here?
Well, there were some great things that did occur as far as missionary work.
Right.
And you have many mass conversions that had happened. And some of these conversions that had happened sometimes as a demonstration of the supremacy of our God versus yours kind of thing. I can think of one, I apologize, I can't remember the particular missionary, but I believe it was under Gregory. He was sent, and he was going to the Germanic tribes who had worshipped Thor. That was their god. And so you had this oak of Thor, and that was their sacred tree,
right,
and all this sort of thing. So this man, this missionary, takes an axe to it, and it is said that as soon as he took the axe to it and he took one swing at it and hit it, that the wind ended up toppling it over. And so they're kind of like, yeah, your God's better, So there were some mass conversions in that sense. There were other times in which the conversions of what we would consider the barbarians, or what history considers the barbarians, sometimes it was forceful. And you had a lot of criticisms from some bishops and church fathers because, it's an individual thing when you become a Christian, So there were some negative things as far as that goes, but you have in the regions of what we would consider these barbarian tribes, that people are going and the gospel is spreading and it's showing the supremacy of Christ. So there was a number of good things that happened, like with Leif Erikson going into Greenland,
right,
and spreading the gospel.
That gets us up to really the millennium here. So we're kind of working our way into AD 1000, and we'll kind of pin a bow on it here at the end to kind of, because this is a big deal, like what we're getting into here, and we're kind of working our way up to this. So we'll finish up here on this second part, talking about this last century, really at 1000 to roughly 1100 AD. There's 2 major events that happened, but we'll focus on one here and pick up with the other one in just a moment. But a lot of people would refer to it as the Great Schism, or if you had to put it in chronological order, Schism of 1054. So I got 3 major questions here for you.
Okay.
Number 1, why can't we get along? Number 2, who is involved in this? And then 3, what were the results of this really landscape-changing situation here?
Well, to the first question, why can't we all get along? I really don't have an answer to that one. But no, you have doctrinal differences between the Eastern and the Western churches. But the thing with that and the Western Church and then the Eastern Orthodox is that it was a gradual thing over time.
Yeah.
So you have, earlier in the centuries, if we got to go back a few hundred years into the 400s, you have Leo the First, who's like the first pope. Obviously, they would consider Peter to be the first pope, but
Sure.
Leo. And you have Leo that wants to establish himself as the supreme bishop, more so than over against everybody else. He wants the seat of Rome to be, the authority over the entire church. Because again, when you go back to Irenaeus, and in the 2nd century, and Irenaeus is arguing with the Gnostics, and one of the tools that he used to argue against the Gnostics was pointing to the Bishop of Rome. You have a succession of bishops that came from Peter and Paul that aren't teaching what you're teaching.
Yeah.
And so we're establishing the authority of the church, and he's using the Bishop of Rome or that succession of line. Now, this is going to be used again in order to establish the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome because he's sitting in Peter's seat, kind of thing. So it starts with Leo. And especially with Leo establishing himself the way he did, because it's going to be Leo that has that meeting with Attila the Hun. And it's going to be Leo that talks him out of going into Italy, invading Italy.
And to catch everybody up to speed, just real quickly, Attila the Hun, who is this character?
Well, he was a very powerful leader, without question.
Right.
He's going to be one that is going to gain great victories against the Romans. And it's a very interesting thing that he would not go ahead and invade Rome in the sense of causing its fall even earlier than what it actually did. But he was a force to be reckoned with for sure. And you have Leo that meets with him, and Leo persuades him not to invade. Now, how all that went down, I don't know. I would be very curious to know exactly what he said to him to get him not to do that. But within 3 years, you have other barbarians that are coming in that are sacking Rome. And Leo goes out again and convinces him not to burn it. But there's going to be 15 days in which they're going to plunder everything. But they're not going to burn it. So after the 15 days are up, you have the people who are looking to Leo as they know what he's done for them. Their emperor didn't do it. Their emperor over the West.
Right.
It was Leo. So you have the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome beginning in those in those years specifically, but over time you have the power struggle between the two, because you have the bishop or the Patriarch of Constantinople, who's seen as an equal to the Patriarch of Rome, obviously causing conflict there. You have a controversy that erupted in the coming years as well over what's called the Filioque, which is within I believe it was the Chalcedonian Creed, speaking of the Spirit of God, in reference to him, that he proceeds from the Father. That's the way the creed read.
Right.
And that's what both sides of the churches had agreed to, at the Ecumenical Council. Well, along the way, the Western Church adds in the Filioque, which proceeds from the Father and the Son.
Right.
Now, the Eastern Church is saying, you didn't have authority to do that. Who are you to add to the creed that was set down by the Ecumenical Council? And so that begins to cause conflicts because it's a conflict of authority. The West is continually trying to show its authority as being the supreme over the East. And again, when you're looking at the East over here, you're having the belief that the Bishop of Rome is just one of the patriarchs. And even if he has first chair, even if he's in one sense the leader, he's still equal to everybody else. Well, obviously the Pope don't see it that way. So you're moving on in history over these power struggles. The West is getting tired of this guy in the East claiming that he's their emperor, and they keep finding ways of being independent from them, as we've talked about already, especially with Charlemagne and all of that. So at the time that this is going to occur, you have, again, very egotistical men who are going to basically war with each other. Mm-hmm. So you have Bishop Humbert, who's actually a cardinal, rather, who was he was a French Benedictine abbot, later become a cardinal, but he's going to be the papal secretary of Leo IX. Now you have, in Constantinople, you have Michael I, who is the patriarch there. So Cardinal Humbert hears of these criticisms that are hurled hurled against the Western Church because of the filioque,
right?
Because they're using unleavened bread in their masses instead of leavened bread, because they see this as catering to a Jewish idea, using unleavened bread, because of the iconoclasm. So there's a number of things that are being criticized, and so Humbert hears of this, and it was through a letter. And he takes this letter, he translates it from Greek into Latin, he takes it to the Pope, and he says, look at what they're saying about us. Look at what they're saying about you. So obviously, this is going to cause great conflict. So Humbert, with a band of men, goes to Constantinople in order to try to fix this, right? And so Michael Cerelius is what he was called, Michael Cerelius. In order to put them in their place, he doesn't see them for 3 weeks. They're there to talk, and he's not going to talk to them for 3 weeks, which only furthers the divide and the anger. So by the time that these two guys get together, these two men with large egos, their conversation ends up turning into a shouting match, and nothing gets reconciled. So that you have Michael Cerelius, who is performing the Mass in the Church of Holy Sophia, and all of a sudden you have Cardinal Humbert marches into the church and slaps a bull of excommunication on the altar. And so what does he do? Well, Michael Cerelius gives him a bull of excommunication as well. So these two guys excommunicate each other. And oddly enough, because of everything else that had occurred and the differences between the two, there was already a language barrier. The West is speaking primarily Latin, East is speaking Greek. So there's different ideas, all kinds of things. And then all of that just built up into this one event where these two guys couldn't reconcile and end up excommunicating each other.
As the great theologian Jed Clampett would say, what in tarnation is going on out here? So we've got ourselves in a situation now.
Yeah, because within a few decades, within at least a 50-year period of this occurring, you're going to have the first crusade that happens.
Right.
And this is obviously going to be some very difficult problems that are going to flow into the time of the Crusades because of this event here of the Great Schism.
Right. So really nothing accomplished other than massive division.
Yeah.
So this is almost, I guess to use an old phrase, almost the straw that breaks the camel's back. Mm-hmm. So we definitely now have Eastern, Western churches with some very distinct beliefs and theology and clearly different leaders in different directions. Like you mentioned, not just that, but language barriers, culture barriers. We're in two different directions here, so to speak. So, and you mentioned by the end of the century here, around I think it's 1096, we're going to see Pope Urban II. He's going to call for what we would call the Crusade, the very first one of many, and we'll get into those in later episodes. They're going to go into really kind of drive out the Turks, so to speak, there in the eastern Christian areas of Constantinople. He wants to supposedly liberate the church and the Holy Sepulchre there in Jerusalem, and He's got a lot on his plate. He wants to reopen the Holy Land for Christian pilgrims. And, oh, by the way, along the way, you get forgiveness if you fight for us. So apparently he's going to invent salvation now, too. So he's got a lot going on there on his plate. So, we'll talk about that when we get into the next episode. So we'll kind of wrap it up there at the end of 1100. So we'll kind of pick up there at those first crusades and dive into that a little bit more and get into what I consider some real meat and potatoes of church history coming up, and kind of get us up to, what we're really wanting to get to, the Reformation. And so hopefully you guys will tune in with us next time. Josh, thank you again, man. This was extremely good. We learned a lot here. I think other people would benefit from it as well. So if you haven't listened to the first one, please go back and do that. Again, you can find those on our YouTube channel. You can also find those on Apple Podcast. If you haven't done so already, check us out on our website. Again, that's deeplyrootedpodcast.com. And go on over if you'd like to on social media and join up with us on our Facebook group page there. Got a lot going on I think you'd be interested in. That way you can connect with us and kind of hear about what we're doing, and also any announcements that we drop about new episodes and things that we might be involved in. So again, until next time, we hope you guys enjoyed this, and we pray that you have a great week in Jesus.